Snowflakes clung to the frosted glass as Nora Ellison wheeled herself through the diner's heavy door, the bell chiming in time with the icy wind swirling behind her. Neon light cast a blue shimmer over the blacktop, pooling across her lap and the battered wheels of her chair. Anchorage nights had always pressed down hard, but tonight the weight seemed doubled. Each table full of faces too polite to stare, too curious to look away. She chose a booth near the window, steam rising from her coat as warmth met winter. Coffee aroma mingled with the tang of grilled salmon and fries. Yet every sound, the scraping of boots, the laughter from the far table felt sharpened as if the cold had followed her inside. Nora adjusted the scarf around her neck, hands steady, pretending not to notice the glances that darted her way and then vanished, like headlights lost in a blizzard. A group of teenagers sprawled in the corner, their voices louder than the radio's crackle. One snickered, mimicking the faint squeak of her wheelchair. The others grinned, their whispers growing bold, each joke a flake of frost against her skin. She focused on the snowfall outside, biting her lip. Her phone vibrated on the tabletop. A blocked number. She hesitated, then answered, heart racing. "Stay strong, kid, we're coming." The line clicked dead. Nora stared at her reflection in the glass, neon tangled in the tracks of melting snow, and felt something shift deep inside. Outside, somewhere beyond the parking lot, engines rumbled in the distance, promising that nothing in this quiet diner would ever be the same. What happened next would leave everyone speechless. Nora Ellison had grown used to the sharp chill of Anchorage winters, but never to the colder glances that followed her wherever she went. Life with cerebral palsy meant moving through the world at a different pace, each sidewalk a challenge, every errand a test of patience and grit. Since childhood, her wheelchair had become more than a necessity. It was an extension of her existence, a constant reminder that she would never slip quietly into any crowd. People noticed, even if they pretended not to. Some would offer fleeting smiles, their eyes quickly darting elsewhere. Others watched with a gaze that lingered, as if deciphering a puzzle they never wished to solve. She had learned to distinguish the two by the weight of their silence. But poetry had given Nora something precious, a way to carve meaning from the rough edges of daily life. Verses became her companions, scribbled in tattered notebooks she kept tucked in her bag, lines written during sleepless nights when pain lanced through her legs, or loneliness gnawed at her resolve. Words could transform icy sidewalks into rivers, headlights into fireflies, even cruel laughter into wind that passed her by. The city itself, its snow-packed roads, pine-framed houses, distant peaks painted orange by a sun reluctant to rise, became a canvas for her inner world. Her parents, once hopeful that Anchorage's tight-knit spirit might protect their daughter, had grown weary. Jobs kept them late, bills pressed in from every side, and the slow grind of winter dulled their warmth. Nora often felt she occupied the margins, present but out of sight, spoken of in gentle tones, her courage lauded but her reality seldom understood. In the pages of her journal, though, she crafted a new story, one where difference was not a burden but a badge. Poetry was rebellion, a soft, persistent voice that refused to be erased. Every week she made her way to the Blue Moose Diner, a place that smelled of cinnamon and coffee, where the walls were lined with photographs of fishing boats and moose antlers hung above the counter. The wooden booths shone with polish, their seats patched but sturdy. The window sills bristled with potted evergreens brushed with frost. Local fishermen huddled at the bar, hands wrapped around mugs, boots, leaving melting trails on the linoleum. A battered jukebox glowed in the corner, spinning old country tunes. The kitchen hummed with the scent of grilled salmon and frying onions, mixing with the sharper tang of brewed espresso. For a while Nora believed this diner could become a sanctuary, a space immune to the outside world's petty cruelties. She sought comfort in the hum of conversation, the way light flickered off the neon sign, the warmth that filled the space even as the wind howled outside, rattling storm shutters until they threatened to break free. Clara Monroe, the waitress on the late shift, was known for her careful hands and tired smile. Clara moved with a deliberate grace, tray balanced with ease, a silver streak in her hair betraying years of hard work. Her kindness never spilled into pity, But Nora sensed a wall, something in Clara's careful speech. The way she wiped the counter twice before approaching suggested a reluctance to draw unwanted attention. They spoke little beyond polite greeting. Still, Clara's eyes softened whenever she refilled Nora's cup, and her voice grew gentle as she asked if there was anything else she needed. Sometimes Nora wondered if the waitress too felt invisible despite her constant motion, blending into the background of a place she kept running by force of habit. The manager, Elias Holt, kept order from behind the register, his face hidden behind a thick beard and a pair of glasses perched low on his nose. He favored neat ledgers, spotless floors, and a steady stream of regulars. Business mattered more than small talk, and disruptions were discouraged. Elias watched the room with a calculating glance, quick to spot a spilled drink or an unpaid bill but slow to intervene when cruelty arrived, dressed in laughter. Under his watch, the diner ran like a machine, each part in its place, each face accounted for, yet attention pulsed beneath the veneer of comfort. On this evening, as dusk deepened into night and snow began to pile in silent drifts along the curb, Nora rolled her chair into her usual booth and opened her notebook. She glanced at the clock, fingers tapping the table's edge, waiting for inspiration to strike. The warmth inside soothed the ache in her legs, loosening muscles tightened by cold. Behind her, a group of teenagers filed in, their boots thumping, voices weaving through the air like smoke. Jackson Reed led them, a tall boy with a smirk permanently etched into his expression, hair falling over one eye, leather jacket slung over his chair. His friends trailed behind, each feeding off the energy he radiated, emboldened by his swagger. They laughed at jokes only they found funny, tossing paper napkins into a pyramid at the center of the table, oblivious to the hush their presence brought. It was not the first time Nora had encountered Jackson. He made a game of targeting anyone different, his barbs sharp and calculated. For months he had thrown glances and comments Nora's way, nothing overt enough to invite rebuke, but each one landed with a sting. Tonight, though, he was bold. As Nora reached for her pen, Jackson mimicked the squeak of her wheelchair's wheels, exaggerating the sound as he scraped his chair back and forth. His friends burst out laughing, slapping the table. "Hey, careful, she might roll right into the kitchen," one called, voice too loud, face flushed with excitement. Another made a mock spinning gesture, twirling a salt shaker between his hands. The laughter built, a wave that pressed in from all sides. Nora kept her gaze on her notebook, hands shaking, trying to focus on a half-written line. Each taunt chipped away at her concentration, turning the words in her mind to static. She wanted to shrink into herself, to disappear, to will the cold outside to seep in and freeze this moment, erase it forever. Clara hovered nearby, eyes darting between Nora and the teenager. She opened her mouth, then closed it, biting her lip, the tray in her hands rattling ever so slightly. Fear flickered across her face, the fear of saying the wrong thing, of drawing Jackson's anger, of risking her job over one girl's dignity. She looked to Elias, but the manager only shook his head, retreating to the back room, unwilling to get involved. Nora felt her cheeks burn. The warmth that once welcomed her now turned oppressive, thick with unspoken judgment. She stared at the condensation forming on her glass of water, watching droplets race each other down the surface, willing herself not to cry. She pressed her pen harder against the page, but the ink bled, words dissolving into blots. A chair squeaked again, louder this time. Jackson's face appeared beside her, voice low enough for only her to hear. "You think you're special because you roll in here every week? No one wants you around, you know. Why don't you go home?" His breath smelled of soda and mallet. Nora met his gaze, refusing to flinch, but inside she felt herself cracking. The others giggled, the sound a chorus of cruelty, echoing off every wall. Nora's mind raced, searching for an escape, but she found none. The diner that once promised refuge now felt like a cage, every eye a silent accomplice. She took a shaky breath, clutching her notebook as if it might anchor her to something solid. The storm outside intensified, wind whipping flakes across the window, making the neon signs stutter in the glass. Cars passed slowly, their headlights casting ghostly shapes across the walls. Inside, time stretched, every second punctuated by a new insult or a stifled laugh. Nora closed her eyes for a moment, letting the chaos blur, focusing on the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. In that darkness, a line of poetry formed, fragile yet unbreakable, her voice rising above the din, reminding her she was more than their jokes, more than the limitations they saw. When she opened her eyes, resolve settled over her features, quiet and unyielding. She would not let them define her. She would endure as she always had, drawing strength from the storms that battered her and the verses that gave her hope. Silence in the diner was always a thin veneer, easily shattered. That night, as snow deepened along the curbs and headlights glowed dim through swirling flurries, tension prickled the air. Nora sat in her booth, hands trembling beneath the table, pen resting against an open page she could no longer read. Each second seemed to stretch, the clatter of forks and muted conversation growing distant, as though she had drifted behind a pane of glass. Her heart pounded, echoing the gusts, shaking the old frame, while her face burned under the fluorescent hum. Every muscle tightened as she waited for the following remark. The group in the corner grew louder. Jackson tossed a crumpled napkin in her direction, landing just shy of her plate. His laughter, sharp and unkind, cut through the warmth, drawing glances from nearby tables. He leaned over, voice raised. "Missed it. Maybe I'll get it next time." His friends giggled, emboldened by his swagger. Another napkin followed, skimming the edge of Nora's tray. She straightened her back, refusing to flinch, but inside her resolve wavered. The humiliation stung, each new jibe another thread unraveling what little comfort she still found in this place. Clara hovered near the counter, eyes darting between the group and Nora. Her fingers tapped out a restless rhythm along the coffee pot's handle. She wanted to step in, to say something that would halt the cruelty spiraling through the diner, but fear anchored her. Jobs in Anchorage were scarce, and customers with money, even ones as callous as Jackson's friends, kept lights burning and bills paid. Clara bit her lip, shifting her weight from foot to foot, torn between decency and duty. Behind her, Elias kept his gaze fixed on receipts, calculator clicking steadily as he tallied the day's earnings. He heard everything, the taunts, the rising laughter, the sharp intake of breath from Nora's booth, but he didn't look up. To him, disruption meant potential loss, and business left little room for interference in matters he considered fleeting. The manager's indifference hung heavy, a silent permission for cruelty to fester unchecked. The other patrons felt it too. Some watched in uncomfortable silence, unsure whether to intervene. Others busied themselves with their meals, eyes fixed on plates, words dying unspoken in throats. The diner's rustic charm, antlers above the register, paintings of salmon streams, wood-paneled walls, offered no refuge tonight. Even the familiar aroma of coffee, usually comforting, felt out of place amid the growing tension. Outside, wind gusted, rattling storm shutters until they creaked, the windows fogged with breath and heat, but beyond the glass, faint ribbons of green undulated in the sky, the aurora's subtle glow casting a strange light through the skylight above Nora's table. For a moment, she let her gaze drift upward, focusing on the silent dance overhead. It was a small comfort, a reminder that beauty could exist alongside cruelty, but even that solace felt fragile. Jackson, noticing her distraction, seized the opportunity. He rolled another napkin tightly, winding it in his palm before tossing it with a flick. This one struck her notebook, knocking it askew. The friends erupted with fresh laughter, their amusement growing louder, more brazen. "Bullseye," one shouted, slapping the table. Nora closed her eyes, jaw clenched, tears threatened, blurring her vision, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them the satisfaction. Her breath grew shallow, every sound in the room amplified, clinking glasses, scraping chairs, the hiss of the espresso machine, all merging into a cacophony that pressed down on her shoulder. Clara finally approached, tray trembling as she refilled Nora's water. She leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "Are you all right?" Nora nodded, swallowing hard, words caught in her throat. Clara lingered, as if searching for something to say, but the risk was too significant. The waitress straightened, plastered on a smile, and hurried away before Jackson's group could notice her concern. At the counter, Elias pretended not to see the exchange, busying himself with a stack of menu. His hands moved methodically, organizing, cleaning, anything to avoid the reality unraveling in his establishment. The isolation pressed in. Nora glanced around, searching for any sign of support, any friendly face willing to break the pattern. The regulars she recognized avoided her gaze, some shifting in their seats, others retreating deeper into their conversations. A couple near the window whispered, casting nervous glances her way before looking out into the night, unwilling to become targets themselves. Jackson, sensing the crowd's discomfort but mistaking it for approval, doubled down. He began mimicking the sound of her wheelchair, squeaking his chair loudly, and drawing laughter from his friends. "Better oil those wheels, or you'll wake up the whole city," he jeered. Each taunt built on the last, a crescendo of cruelty that made Nora's skin prickle. Still she held her composure, focusing on the cool glass in her hands, the soft brush of fabric beneath her fingers, the steady rhythm of her breath. The world narrowed to the small bubble of her booth, every detail heightened, flickering neon, icy draft crawling across the floor, faint aroma of grilled salmon lingering in the air. Time seemed to splinter, each moment drawn out. Nora's mind raced, replaying every insult, every awkward silence, every opportunity missed by someone to say enough. She wondered if things would ever change, or if this was simply the way the world would remain. Some people too cruel, others too frightened, and she forever caught in between. Outside, the aurora grew brighter, a curtain of green and violet wavering over snowy rooftops. The sight filled her with longing, a desire for escape, for a place where she might be valued, not despite her differences, but because of them. Another napkin landed on her lap. Nora picked it up, fingers shaking, and crumpled it tightly in her palm. Her vision shimmered with unshed tears, but her chin lifted a fraction higher. She refused to be broken. Across the room, Clara watched, regret etched in the lines of her face. She mouthed a silent apology, wishing she dared to do more. Even Elias, for a fleeting second, looked up and met Nora's eyes before quickly looking away, shame flickering in his expression. Nora drew in a slow breath, grounding herself in the reality of the moment. Her entire life had been a lesson in survival, in finding light, even when the world pressed its darkest weight against her. She had written poems about endurance, about strength that grew not from absence of pain, but from refusing to let it define her. Now, those words felt like armor, wrapping around her, protecting what was left of her dignity. Outside, wind roared louder, shaking the neon sign, until it buzzed. The sky shimmered, colors shifting in silent witness to the scene unfolding below. Inside, laughter faltered as the game wore on, unease beginning to take root among the teens. Nora's resilience had not gone unnoticed, even if no one spoke up. In that moment, she made a silent promise, to herself, to anyone watching quietly, that she would not bend. She would hold her ground, as she always had, drawing from the endless Alaskan night, a strength that belonged only to those who refused to yield. When did you last stand up for someone who could? Outside, night settled heavier, snowflakes swirling in relentless silence as the temperature dipped and the city lights shimmered beneath a curtain of green aurora. The world beyond the diner's frosted windows became more shadow than substance, each passing car leaving behind trails of white powder and exhaust. Inside, tension reached a breaking point, every sound sharper. The scrape of boots, the dull thud of a plate, the forced laughter of teenagers too bold in their cruelty. Nora felt the room grow tighter, the air dense with unshed words and glances averted for fear of involvement. Suddenly, a distant vibration rolled through the ground, a rumble so deep it seemed to rise from the earth itself. At first, the sound barely registered, hidden beneath the din of conversation and clatter of silverware. Then the noise grew louder, a low thunder approaching with purpose, engines roaring against the wind, piercing the ordinary night with raw authority. Heads lifted, forks paused, eyes flicked toward the window as headlights materialized, slicing through the gloom. Even Jackson's group fell silent, cocky grins fading, as the noise multiplied. One motorcycle, then another, until the street outside shimmered with chrome and roaring power. Nora froze, breath held tight in her chest. Her phone vibrated once more, a single buzz that seemed to echo the throbbing engines outside. She hesitated, hand trembling as she answered, uncertain what voice awaited her this time. Static crackled, then a gravelly whisper slid through the speaker, calm, commanding, impossible to place. "We're here." The line cut, leaving a chill that rivaled the wind clawing at the glass. Nora stared at her reflection, pale and tense, unsure whether to feel hope or dread. Lights outside painted the snow blue and gold, tire tracks carving patterns across the lot, each machine glinting beneath street lamps and drifting auroras. One by one the bikers descended, leather jackets gleaming, boots stamping a rhythm onto the ice-packed pavement. Exhaust clouds swirled around them, engines still grumbling as they lined up their motorcycles with surgical precision. Each rider dismounted in silence, a practiced ballet of men who had done this countless times before. Their movements spoke of discipline, respect, and a unity that needed no words. At their head strode Gideon Iron Vance, a mountain of a man with a steel-gray beard, eyes like chips of ice, and hands weathered from years riding Alaska's unforgiving highway. His presence radiated command, every step deliberate, every gesture unhurried, his gaze sweeping the lot as if measuring the soul of every bystander. Ice crunched under their boots, echoing in the quiet as they made their way toward the door, leather creaking, chrome buckles catching the green shimmer overhead. The lead rider's shadow fell long across the entryway as Gideon paused beneath the flickering neon, Aurora's glow reflecting in his shades. He glanced at his crew, a silent nod passing between them. The Hells Angels had arrived, not in chaos, but with the steady gravity of a storm building far out at sea. Within the diner, conversation died. Even the radio's static seemed to hush, drowned by anticipation. Jackson shifted in his seat, bravado evaporating as he craned his neck to see what force had rolled into their world. Clara pressed herself against the counter, knuckles white around her tray, a whisper of awe and fear in her posture. Elias, usually so composed, set down his ledger, heart pounding in his chest as he peeked above his glasses. The regulars stared, curiosity wrestling with uncertainty, nobody willing to speak above a breath. The warmth that had once filled the space now felt thin and brittle, fragile against the gathering presence at the door. Gideon pushed the door open, a gust of cold trailing him like a silent herald. The bell overhead rang sharply, cutting the tension as he stepped inside, followed by two riders, whose faces bore the calm of men who had weathered worse storms than this. Snow clung to their boots, melting into dark puddles, the scent of exhaust and leather blending with coffee and grilled fish. Gideon surveyed the room in one sweeping glance, eyes resting on Nora just long enough for her to feel it, an acknowledgement, a promise, a warning to anyone watching. He walked with purpose, heavy boots thudding softly, until he reached a table near the center, seating himself as if he owned the space. His companions did the same, moving in choreographed silence. For a moment, nobody dared move. Jackson swallowed, forced a laugh, but it died quickly, strangled by the weight of so many eyes. His friends shrank in their seats, unsure whether to leave, afraid of what defiance might provoke. Clara hovered near Nora's booth, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. She shot the girl a questioning look, silently asking if she knew what was happening. Nora shook her head, shoulders tense, heart racing with questions she couldn't yet voice. Outside, more engines idled, lights casting twisted shadows across the diner's facade. The biker's presence transformed the familiar into something unfamiliar, every gesture magnified, every word waiting to be spoken heavy with consequence. Gideon removed his gloves, setting them neatly on the table. He waited, allowing the silence to stretch, commanding attention not by force but by being the immovable center around which everything else revolved. The other patrons watched, torn between fascination and caution. The atmosphere changed, brittle edges giving way to an electricity that crackled between tables and booths. Elias gathered his courage, clearing his throat. "Can I get you gentlemen something?" he asked, his voice thinner than usual. Gideon nodded once, the gesture loaded with meaning. "Coffee, hot, for all of us." His voice was deep, quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the diner. Clara moved to obey, tray shaking slightly as she poured mugs, careful not to spill. She placed the drinks on their table, offering a polite smile that went unreturned, her nerves fraying beneath the scrutiny of so many silent witnesses. Jackson tried to rally, whispering to his friends, but his words faltered. The spell had shifted, where cruelty once reigned unchecked. Now uncertainty held sway. The Hells Angels did not threaten or boast. They existed, their very presence a rebuke to every sneer, every joke, every failure to act. Nora watched, caught between fear and a strange new hope, wondering what would happen next. Her phone, still gripped in her hand, lay silent. The last message lingered in her mind. She looked at Gideon, felt his gaze meet hers, and saw something in his eyes that steadied her trembling heart. No longer alone, she sensed the balance tipping, the story moving at last beyond her pain. Outside, auroras flickered brighter, dancing above the line of parked motorcycles, snow catching green and gold in fleeting waves. Engines purred, cold winds swept through the empty lot, yet inside, anticipation reached its peak. In the pause before the next move, every soul in the room understood. The night had changed, and with it, so had the rules. Wind battered the diner's wooden frame, making the neon sign outside flicker wildly. Every gust a reminder of the storm waiting just beyond the glass. Yet, nothing inside rivaled the chill that swept through the room as Gideon Iron Vance stepped fully into the light. Every conversation stopped. Forks hovered midair. The sound of the bell above the door seemed to echo for an eternity as the door closed behind him, sealing the warmth in and the chaos out. Gideon's leather jacket was streaked with melting snow, his boots dripping icy water onto the floor, yet he carried himself as if cold and fear alike meant nothing. He moved slowly, every stride deliberate, an immovable force that shifted the air with its silent gravity. The rest of the Hell's Angels followed his lead, spreading out but never breaking the invisible cord that held them together. Their presence radiated quiet authority, unspoken but absolute. The world outside faded, aurora glimmering faintly through the skylight. As silence pressed in, Jackson and his friends shrank in their booth. Gone was the bravado that had filled the space with laughter and mockery. Jackson's eyes darted to the door, then to his friends, but no one offered an escape. His smirk faltered, hands fidgeting with a napkin he tore into pieces, as if shredding evidence of guilt. The other teenagers avoided looking at anyone, faces flushed, posture closed off. Their power had dissolved, stripped away not by threats, but by the arrival of something unyielding. Around the diner, locals watched, unease mixing with a reluctant admiration. Some tried to appear busy, stirring coffee or reading menus, but all listened closely, drawn by the palpable shift. Regret crept across faces as people remembered their silence, realizing how easily they had surrendered to fear, to convenience, to the belief that speaking up would never matter. Gideon paused just inside, removing his gloves, setting them on a nearby table with methodical precision. He scanned the room with cold blue eyes, gaze lingering on each patron before resting on Nora. His attention was not cursory, it weighed, considered, measured. When he finally spoke, the words were simple yet powerful, his voice carrying a calm that commanded the room. "You're stronger than they'll ever know." The statement was neither a question nor praise, it was a fact, presented for all to hear. Nora felt the strength behind those words, a force that reached past the shame and humiliation she'd endured. Her back straightened, heart racing, embers of courage flickering to life. Clara stood behind the counter, breath held, hands tightening around her order pad. She watched the exchange, longing to be braver, wishing she had said more sooner. Elias gripped the register, jaw clenched, guilt pricking at him for every minute he'd allowed ugliness to fester beneath the veneer of small-town hospitality. Even the regulars, usually quick to crack jokes or mind their business, looked inward, questioning choices made out of habit and self-preservation. The diner's warmth, so inviting minutes before, had turned heavy with self-examination. Gideon didn't address Jackson directly, but his following words made the message clear. Some men find their strength in groups, in laughter that hurts, in crowds that stay quiet. Others find it in standing alone, refusing to be moved by anyone. He didn't raise his voice. The lack of volume forced every person to listen harder, hanging on every syllable. Snow beat against the windows, aurora swirling over the dark horizon, shadows shifting across the diner's wooden floor. For Jackson and his friends, the realization of being seen, truly seen, brought discomfort sharper than any insult. Nora glanced at her notebook, pen poised above the page, hands trembling less than before. The biker's words filled the silence left by years of stares, unspoken pity, and whispered cruelties. She felt the eyes of the room on her, not with scorn but with a strange new respect, as if they had glimpsed her true self, for the first time. The power dynamic shifted. No longer the target, she became a mirror for everyone else's conscience. Elias cleared his throat, struggling for composure. "We try to keep this place decent," he mumbled, more to himself than anyone else. Clara nodded, stepping forward, voice soft, yet steady. "Everyone deserves dignity here." Her eyes met Nora's, apology shining in their depths. The staff's regret, finally voiced, became a salve, soothing some of the wounds left by their inaction. Around the room, heads nodded in agreement, some more hesitant than others, but the tide had changed. Jackson's hand shook as he placed his napkin on the table. The bravado that once defined him was gone, replaced by uncertainty and a trace of shame. His friends shifted, mumbling apologies too quiet for anyone to hear. None dared to meet Gideon's gaze. The biker watched them, not with contempt but with a cold honesty that cut through pretense. "You have a choice, always," he said. "Sometimes all it takes is one voice to remind you what matters." Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the frame, making the building tremble as if in agreement. The aurora flared, casting green light across snowdrifts piling up near the entrance. Nora felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the words spoken but for the weight they carried. She wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time, she believed others saw her resilience, her battle, her spirit. The staff, the bikers, even some locals began to re-examine themselves, wondering why it had taken outsiders to teach them courage. The air vibrated with the promise of change. Gideon rose, adjusting his jacket, his presence as commanding as when he'd entered. Before stepping away, he met Nora's eyes one last time, offering a subtle nod that spoke of shared understanding, strength recognized, dignity restored. "Remember," he said, "who in your life needs you to speak up today." The words lingered, drifting over every table, settling into memory. Outside, engines rumbled, wind howled and the night pressed close. Inside, for the first time, hope flickered, small, fragile, but burning with a power that could not be ignored. A gust of wind battered the diner's wooden frame, the neon sign outside flickering with each icy blast. Inside, every pair of eyes lingered on Gideon as he settled into his seat, boots planted firmly, presence unwavering. The tension had thickened into something tangible, pressing down on the room with invisible hands. No one spoke. Jackson glanced at his friends, smirk fading as he recognized the shift. He was no longer center stage. The Hells Angels dominated the space by doing nothing more than existing, their calm composure a sharp contrast to the chaos that had filled the air moments before. Coffee steamed from the mugs on their table, the aroma mingling with exhaust and melting snow. Gideon's hands, scarred but steady, wrapped around the cup as he studied the diner in a single sweeping glance. He looked at Nora, looked, as if seeing past the wheelchair and teenage nerves straight to the core of who she was. She braced herself, unsure what to expect. A flutter of dread and something unfamiliar blossoming in her chest. Gideon gave a nod, barely perceptible, a gesture of recognition she hadn't realized she needed. "You're stronger than they'll ever know," he said, voice low but powerful. The words landed with a quiet authority, neither pity nor empty encouragement, just truth. Nora met his gaze, startled by the respect there, feeling her spine straighten with borrowed strength. Jackson tried to reassert himself, clearing his throat with a forced laugh. "So you all here for a show?" His tone wavered, bravado undercut by the way his foot tapped anxiously against the tile. Gideon didn't bother to respond. His focus remained on Nora. Another biker, younger but equally composed, regarded the group of teens with an expression both curious and unimpressed. The room held its breath. Even the clink of silverware seemed to hesitate, waiting for the balance to tip. Elias lingered by the register, hands gripping the counter, regret flickering behind his spectacle. Clara hovered near the pie case, fingers knotting the edge of her apron, eyes darting between Nora and the bikers. The other patrons watched in silence, some ashamed, some hopeful, a few simply afraid to move. The only sound for a moment was the whistle of wind sneaking through cracks in the windows, rattling the glass in its frame. Nora could almost feel the building itself tense, every beam and nail straining under the weight of unspoken reckoning. Gideon leaned back, boots thudding softly against the floor, gaze unwavering. "You boys got a lot to say when it's just you and someone alone," he said, voice barely above a murmur, yet everyone heard. "What happens when someone is watching who doesn't care about your noise?" Jackson blanched, face flushing, eyes darting to his friends for backup that didn't come. The false confidence he'd worn all evening crumbled, leaving only embarrassment. One of his companions looked down, twisting a napkin in his hand. Another stared fixedly at the salt shaker, wishing for invisibility. Clara took a step forward, her voice soft but resolute. Enough. Everyone deserves respect in here. Her hands trembled, but she did not retreat. Elias nodded, guilt written across his face. We run a decent place, he said, more to himself than anyone else. The regulars glanced at each other, some shamefaced, a few nodding in quiet agreement. The spell had broken, the game exposed for what it truly was, a failure of courage, not just from a handful of teenagers, but from everyone who had chosen to look away. Nora sat straighter, watching the scene unfold, a wave of emotion building within her, relief, fear, gratitude, anger, all mingling in her chest. She felt the cold pressing in from outside, the storm raging just beyond the glass. But inside she was held together by Gideon's words and the steady support of strangers who had chosen, finally, to stand. For the first time since entering the diner, she allowed herself to hope for more than just survival. Gideon returned his focus to Nora, his eyes softening. People like to talk about strength, but most don't understand it, he said. Strength isn't in loud voices or cruel jokes. It's in sitting where others want you gone, in holding your ground when the world tries to move you. His words settled over the crowd, a challenge and an invitation. You're here. That's more than most can say. Jackson attempted another joke, but the room offered him nothing. No laughter, no validation, only the measured silence of witnesses waking to their complicity. Nora looked at him, feeling the old ache return, but this time it was different. She wasn't invisible anymore. The diner, the bikers, even the regulars had seen what was done. She found herself wondering how many times cruelty had flourished, simply because no one dared to interrupt it. A motorcycle revved outside, echoing through the lot, a sharp reminder that the world beyond these walls could change in an instant. Snow spiraled past the windows, piling against the entryway. Nora thought of every night she'd written lines in secret, every moment she'd questioned her place, and felt something shift inside, an ember of resolve, fanned by Gideon's calm. The community was watching, her courage mattered. The bikers never raised their voice. Their power lay in presence, the certainty that they would not let injustice pass unchallenged. The manager swallowed hard, approaching the teens, his voice firmer. You're done here tonight. I won't have this in my place. Jackson tried to protest, but even his friends shook their heads. The battle was over before it began. Gideon finished his coffee, setting the mug down with finality. It takes nothing to join in laughter at someone's expense, he said, eyes sweeping the room. It takes everything to stand up for someone you've ignored. The words lingered, settling into the bones of the building, a memory that would echo long after the last motorcycle faded into the Alaskan. Nora felt gratitude surge, mingling with a wish that every diner, every school, every crowded room could feel this shift. Silence broken, respect restored. As the wind howled louder and snow drifted higher, Nora sat surrounded by witnesses who had learned, however late, the weight of their silence. She looked around, seeing not just faces but the possibility of change. Gideon caught her eye one last time, a silent encouragement for the journey ahead. Who in your life needs you to speak up today? The storm outside had not relented, but the mood within the diner shifted in quiet, immeasurable ways. Gone was the old chill of isolation that had clung to Nora's shoulders since her first step, or roll through that door. For the first time in memory, she did not shrink from the gaze of others. Instead, she met their eyes and found something new: recognition. Not just for her wheelchair or the verses she scribbled in secret, but for the person she was and the strength she'd shown. With every glance exchanged, she sensed the community seeing her, really seeing her, as if a fog had finally lifted from their vision. Gideon lingered a moment longer near the door, his broad frame outlined by aurora light shining through the frosted window. His companions joined him, each giving Nora a nod that brimmed with a respect, as honest as the northern wind. The eldest of the riders, his hair streaked silver beneath a battered helmet, broke the hush with a deep, weathered voice. You've got heart, sister. More than most who have ever walked these roads. Nora flushed at the word, a strange warmth filling spaces long left cold. "Sister," he'd said, as if she'd been invited into an unspoken fellowship, one where courage was valued above all, and scars, whether visible or hidden, marked you as family. Clara approached, apron strings trailing behind her, voice trembling not with fear but with emotion. "I'm sorry, Nora. I should have spoken up. I promise it won't happen again. If you ever need anything at all, you'll have it." She reached for Nora's hand, fingers squeezing gently. There was no trace of pity, only remorse and a genuine desire to do better. Nora squeezed back, forgiving the silence of the past with a simple gesture, understanding that change rarely comes all at once, but grows slowly, one apology, one kindness at a time. Elias emerged from behind the counter, posture different now, less rigid, more human. "This place is supposed to be a home for everyone," he said, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. "We lost sight of that. It won't happen again." The regulars scattered among booths and bar stools murmured their agreement. One old fisherman, usually lost behind a cloud of cigarette smoke, nodded at Nora as she passed, his weathered face softening into a genuine smile. A mother dining with her daughter waved shyly. Even the teens, now subdued and regretful, kept their distance, but their eyes held apology. Overhead, the aurora cast a green glow over the diner's roof, painting shifting patterns across the white drifts and neon sign. The spectacle drew people to the windows, momentarily uniting the crowd in silent awe. Nora watched the swirling lights with a sense of wonder she'd almost forgotten, feeling as though the sky itself had chosen to bear witness to her new beginning. In that emerald radiance, the night seemed less harsh, the cold less biting. Hope flickered in every breath, subtle but unmistakable. Gideon and his crew prepared to leave, zipping jackets, donning gloves, each movement measured. As they filed outside, engines started, headlights piercing the darkness. Before Gideon mounted his bike, he paused, catching Nora's gaze through the window. He raised a gloved hand in salute, a gesture not of farewell but of respect and solidarity. She returned it, feeling a kinship that transcended words or differences. The roar of engines soon faded into the night, replaced by the soft hush of falling snow and distant wind. Inside, conversation slowly resumed, but the topics had changed. Talk turned to the aurora, to the promise of spring, to memories of other long winters endured together. The undercurrent, though, was unmistakable. People regarded Nora not as an object of curiosity or pity, but as a peer, a neighbor, even an example. Clara brought her another cup of coffee on the house, pouring it with a steady hand. Elias checked in with a respectful nod. A young boy, inspired by the events, slipped her a folded note before leaving, shyly confessing that he too wrote poetry and hoped she might read his someday. Nora's sense of isolation melted as quickly as the ice on her. Each gesture, a smile, a wave, a kind word repaired what had been broken, stitch by careful stitch. She discovered the quiet joy of belonging, not for what she lacked or the burdens she bore, but for her resilience and willingness to remain visible when it was easier to disappear. The verses that once flowed from her pen in darkness now begged to be shared, voices yearning for daylight. The diner, too, seemed transformed. Where once it was just a refuge from the wind, it became a gathering place for those in search of warmth, not just from the heater but from each other. People lingered longer, conversations stretched further, and laughter rang clearer. Even the decor, photos of fishing trips, local artwork, potted evergreens took on new meaning, symbols of a community learning to welcome every part of itself, rough edges and all. Days passed, and the story of that night rippled beyond the diner's walls. Neighbors spoke of Nora's courage at church suppers and in grocery lines. The teens who once jeered now offered hesitant greetings, their former hostility replaced by uncertain respect. Word reached the local paper, and soon Nora's poetry found its way onto bulletin boards, read aloud at school assemblies and community meetings. She was no longer invisible. Her voice had become an anchor for others still searching for theirs. One evening, as Nora left the diner beneath a sky streaked with aurora green and violet, she paused on the ramp, letting the cold bite her cheeks. Above, stars shone bright, their light unbroken. She wheeled toward home, heart lighter than it had been in years, gratitude rising with each breath. Her scars were not gone, nor the memories of pain, but the certainty tempered them that kindness, once set in motion, could transform even the harshest landscape. The storm eventually faded, snowbanks receded, sidewalks cleared, and spring's promise glimmered on the horizon. Yet the lessons lingered, written into the woodwork and woven into daily life. Nora moved through the world now with her head high, knowing that what mattered most was not being spared hardship but being seen, valued and remembered. The diner remained a beacon, its lights shining into the night, welcoming all who passed, no matter their journey. How can you make someone feel seen today? Anchorage moved at its rhythm, a place shaped by tides and wind, where stories lingered longer than footprints in the snow. The events at the Blue Moose Diner did not vanish with the passing storm. Instead, they rippled outward, weaving themselves into the fabric of daily life. In the quiet days that followed, townspeople found themselves returning, again and again, to what had transpired within those wooden walls. The incident became a touchstone, a reminder of the power and peril of silence. Jackson Reed walked the snowy streets in restless circles, his confidence rattled. He no longer strode through the school hallways with effortless swagger, nor did his voice dominate the laughter echoing from the back of the bus. Guilt gnawed at him sharper than any reprimand. The memory of Gideon's eyes, unflinching and cold as glacial water, haunted his sleep. Shame made his face burn whenever he glimpsed Nora, yet for days he avoided her, unable to summon the courage to speak. He saw how others treated her now with respect, deference, even curiosity. The change unsettled him, forcing uncomfortable questions about who he was and who he might still become. The town as a whole faced its reckoning. Neighbors greeted one another in the grocery store, conversations drifting inevitably to what had happened that night. Some confessed regret for failing to intervene, and others vowed to be different in the future. At church, prayers included pleas for greater empathy, while teachers led discussions about kindness and community. The shift was not immediate nor complete, but it took root, subtle and persistent as moss along the river's edge. Elias Holt, always practical and guarded, became gentler with customers. He paid closer attention to the atmosphere of his establishment, watching not just for unpaid bills, but for the small cruelties that could blossom if left unchecked. Clara Monroe, too, underwent a quiet transformation. She spoke more freely now, standing up for anyone who might need a voice, her courage blossoming in the shadow of what she once failed to do. Together, they set a new tone, ensuring the Blue Moose was more than a refuge from the cold. It became a place of belonging, a haven against both winter and indifference. Nora's poetry, once scribbled furtively in the margins of notebooks, began to travel beyond her hands. Clara started pinning verses to the diner's corkboard, each one signed with Nora's delicate handwriting. Locals lingered to read them, sometimes asking for copies to share at home or school. The words spoke of pain and perseverance, snowdrifts and starfields, of loneliness and the slow birth of hope. Through those verses, the town glimpsed the world through Nora's eyes, finding beauty in small mercies and strength in vulnerability. Her voice became a gentle wind, reshaping how people understood themselves and each other. In time, even Jackson could not escape the shift. One afternoon, as ice sparkled in the weak sunlight and fjords lay silent beneath a pale sky, he approached Nora in the school hallway, his shoulders slumped, his gaze lowered, and his words stuck in his throat. He began, pausing to swallow nerves. I'm sorry. He managed to meet her eyes, his rimmed red. For all of it. I didn't think. I was wrong. The apology was clumsy, reluctant, yet honest. Nora studied him, searching for the sneer that once lived on his lips. It was gone. She nodded, offering forgiveness not as a gift, but as a chance for him to grow. It was enough. Jackson walked away changed, his world narrowed and widened all at once. The story of that night gained quite a traction, reaching as far as the local newspaper. A reporter interviewed Nora, capturing her words with care, sharing her poems with a broader audience. Soon strangers recognized her in the street, offering encouragement, sometimes sharing their struggle. Parents pointed her out to their children, holding her up as proof that courage could belong to anyone, regardless of what life set in their path. Alaskan winter pressed on, but now, instead of feeling boxed in by darkness, the town looked for light in unexpected places. On clear evenings, people gathered near the fjord's edge, bundled in scarves and mittens, watching the northern lights unfurl above still waters. They spoke in softer voices, reflecting on their choices and the meaning of community. The icy water below mirrored both the sky and the changes rippling through Anchorage, shifting, deepening, never quite the same from one day to the next. Nora continued writing, her notebooks filling with new verses, some raw, others tender, all authentic. She began reading aloud at open mic nights hosted by the diner, her words a balm for anyone who had ever felt invisible or unheard. Listeners found solace in her imagery, inspired by her journey from isolation to accept. Even the teens who once mocked her attended, listening quietly at the back, learning the value of humility and renewal. Elias sometimes stepped into the cold to stand beneath the aurora, hands in pockets, breath clouding in the dark. He pondered the fragility of reputation and the strength found in choosing better, again and again. Clara brought her daughter to hear Nora recite, pride blooming where once there had been only regret. She made a habit of checking in on regulars, asking questions that went beyond the surface, ensuring no one else slipped through the cracks. Anchorage, like the fjord's waters, became a mirror for its people, reflecting not only flaws but also the possibility of transformation. Each person bore the memory of that long night, the lesson echoing in ordinary gestures, a hand extended, a smile freely given, a voice raised against injustice. The wounds from before remained, but healing had begun, stitched together by courage, forgiveness and words that refused to fade. For Nora the journey continued, each day a blend of struggle and grace. She moved through her world differently, not untouched by sorrow but buoyed by connection. Where once she feared being overlooked, she now met each morning ready to be seen, her poetry a lighthouse on the rugged shore. The story of a cruel joke, a moment of intervention, and a town's slow awakening became legend, carried forward by those determined never again to stand by in silence. Anchorage moved at its rhythm, a place shaped by tides and wind, where stories lingered longer than footprints in the snow. The events at the Blue Moose Diner did not vanish with the passing storm. Instead, they rippled outward, weaving themselves into the fabric of daily life. In the quiet days that followed, townspeople found themselves returning, again and again, to what had transpired within those wooden walls. The incident became a touchstone, a reminder of the power and peril of silence. Jackson Reed walked the snowy streets in restless circles, his confidence rattled. He no longer strode through the school hallways with effortless swagger, nor did his voice dominate the laughter echoing from the back of the bus. Guilt gnawed at him, sharper than any reprimand. The memory of Gideon's eyes, unflinching and cold as glacial water, haunted his sleep. Shame made his face burn whenever he glimpsed Nora, yet for days he avoided her, unable to summon the courage to speak. He saw how others treated her now, with respect, deference, even curiosity. The change unsettled him, forcing uncomfortable questions about who he was and who he might still become. The town as a whole faced its reckoning. Neighbors greeted one another in the grocery store, conversations drifting inevitably to what had happened that night. Some confessed regret for failing to intervene, and others vowed to be different in the future. At church, prayers included pleas for greater empathy, while teachers led discussions about kindness and community. The shift was not immediate nor complete, but it took root, subtle and persistent as moss along the river's edge. Elias Holt, always practical and guarded, became gentler with customers. He paid closer attention to the atmosphere of his establishment, watching not just for unpaid bills but for the small cruelties that could blossom if left unchecked. Clara Monroe, too, underwent a quiet transformation. She spoke more freely now, standing up for anyone who might need a voice, her courage blossoming in the shadow of what she once failed to do. Together they set a new tone, ensuring the Blue Moose was more than a refuge from the cold. It became a place of belonging, a haven against both winter and indifference. Nora's poetry, once scribbled furtively in the margins of notebooks, began to travel beyond her hands. Clara started pinning verses to the diner's corkboard, each one signed with Nora's delicate handwriting. Locals lingered to read them, sometimes asking for copies to share at home or school. The words spoke of pain and perseverance, snowdrifts and starfields, of loneliness and the slow birth of hope. Through those verses the town glimpsed the world through Nora's eyes, finding beauty in small mercies and strength in vulnerability. Her voice became a gentle wind, reshaping how people understood themselves and each other. In time, even Jackson could not escape the shift. One afternoon, as ice sparkled in the weak sunlight and fjords lay silent beneath a pale sky, he approached Nora in the school hallway, his shoulders slumped, his gaze lowered, and his words stuck in his throat. He began, pausing to swallow nerves. "I'm sorry." He managed to meet her eyes, his rimmed red, "for all of it. I didn't think. I was wrong." The apology was clumsy, reluctant, yet honest. Nora studied him, searching for the sneer that once lived on his lips. It was gone. She nodded, offering forgiveness not as a gift, but as a chance for him to grow. It was enough. Jackson walked away, changed. His world narrowed and widened all at once. The story of that night gained quite a traction, reaching as far as the local newspaper. A reporter interviewed Nora, capturing her words with care, sharing her poems with a broader audience. Soon strangers recognized her in the street, offering encouragement, sometimes sharing their struggle. Parents pointed her out to their children, holding her up as proof that courage could belong to anyone, regardless of what life set in their path. Alaskan winter pressed on, but now, instead of feeling boxed in by darkness, the town looked for light in unexpected places. On clear evenings, people gathered near the fjord's edge, bundled in scarves and mittens, watching the northern lights unfurl above still waters. They spoke in softer voices, reflecting on their choices and the meaning of community. The icy water below mirrored both the sky and the changes rippling through Anchorage, shifting, deepening, never quite the same from one day to the next. Nora continued writing, her notebooks filling with new verses, some raw, others tender, all authentic. She began reading aloud at open mic nights hosted by the diner, her words a balm for anyone who had ever felt invisible or unheard. Listeners found solace in her imagery, inspired by her journey from isolation to acceptance. Even the teens who once mocked her attended, listening quietly at the back, learning the value of humility and renewal. Elias sometimes stepped into the cold to stand beneath the aurora, hands in pockets, breath clouding in the dark. He pondered the fragility of reputation and the strength found in choosing better. Again and again, Clara brought her daughter to hear Nora recite, pride blooming where once there had been only regret. She made a habit of checking in on regulars, asking questions that went beyond the surface, ensuring no one else slipped through the cracks. Anchorage, like the fjord's waters, became a mirror for its people, reflecting not only flaws but also the possibility of transformation. Each person bore the memory of that long night, the lesson echoing in ordinary gestures, a hand extended, a smile freely given, a voice raised against injustice. The wounds from before remained, but healing had begun, stitched together by courage, forgiveness, and words that refused to fade. For Nora the journey continued, each day a blend of struggle and grace. She moved through her world differently, not untouched by sorrow but buoyed by connection. Where once she feared being overlooked, she now met each morning, ready to be seen, her poetry a lighthouse on the rugged shore. The story of a cruel joke, a moment of intervention, and a town's slow awakening became legend, carried forward by those determined never again to stand by in silence.